Hello, I'm Shigeki Yamaguchi, Senior Executive Vice President of NTT Data. I'm in charge of helping executives to transform business by leveraging digital technologies. We have a lot of experience of digital transformation project and developed the framework to succeed in digital transformation. Today, I'm delighted to introduce to you a book and its author, and I was strongly impressed by. The book is Winning the Right Game, written by Dr. Ron Adner. Dr. Ron Adner is Professor of Strategy and Entrepreneurship at the Tax School of Business at Dartmouth College. His award-winning research introduces a new perspective on value creation and competitive when industry boundaries break down in the wake of ecosystem disruption. His two books, The Wide Range, published in 2012, and Winning the Right Game, published in October 2021, have been heralded as landmark contribution to the strategy literature. Dr. Adner, thank you for your time. I'm glad to see you again.
Oh, it's a pleasure to see you again,
Yeah.
Yamaguchi-san.
Thank you, Dr. Adner. Firstly, let me share our digital transformation framework before going to an interview. This slide shows the overview. There are a lot of digital technologies under development. I categorize these into four: combat, connect, algorithm, and cognize. When these technologies are combined, they will greatly change the society and economies. Advances in digital technology are having an impact on the strategy, organizational capabilities, organizational structure of large companies, and managers of large companies are required to understand and take advantage of the impact. What is unique about our framework is that based on the economic principles that digital creates, such as ubiquitous touch point, personalization, uncertainty reduction with data, we logically deduce what strategy and what organization capabilities, what organization structures are required. We believe that customer value reinvention strategy is necessary for large corporations. It is for planning services and business that utilize digital technology to help customers solve real-life problems. It is often called jobs. This slide provides an example of an auto insurance company. Next, please. We believe that organizations that create new customer value will need a flat, fast-moving, agile organization that covers the entire customer experience, rather than a hierarchical organization that manufactures high-quality product. Next slide. Agile business organizations require different management capabilities from traditional business organizations. Leaders of traditional large companies need the ability to manage existing organization and new digital organization in an integrated manner, leveraging the customer relations and manufacturing capabilities which existing organizations have for digital services. It is necessary to create a learning organization that shares the vision of the entire company with all employees, is not bound by existing values, and always learns new things. Next slide, please. Digital technologies can reduce transaction costs, allowing companies to outsource work to outside partners instead of insourcing, or to collaborate with new partners to offer new services to customers. We believe that the relationship with manufacturing partners will not have necessarily fixed, but can evolve to be a flexible trading system through the market. So, thank you. Dr. Adner, you described 3 major points in your book, Winning the Right Game. First, the value proposition to customers should not be considered in terms of goods and services alone, but from the customer experience perspectives. Second, in order to provide value from the customer experience, it is necessary to build an ecosystem of multiple companies using digital technologies. And third, partners providing complementary goods in the ecosystem sometimes become rivals through changes in technology. I think that the first point, the value proposition from the customer experience perspective, is similar to our digital transformation framework. And the second point, the concept of ecosystem creation will enhance our framework, in which advances in digital technology will lead to reduced transaction costs and smooth collaboration among multiple firms to deliver new customer value. And you also mentioned in your book that a complement can become too good and begin to undermine a leader's value creation. This can happen without the change of the direction of or intent of the complementer. This mechanism is quite different from the classical disruption. In classical disruption, substitutes that become enough can threaten to obsolete the existing technology for creating value. This mechanism is very insightful. I would like to explore more from you about this point through this interview. Now, I have prepared some questions, so let me start by asking about winning the right game. So, I will ask first question. It is believed that Kodak failed due to its inability to shift from film technology to digital camera technology. Interestingly enough, you analyze that the company in fact successfully had managed the shift in technology such as capture and produce from analog to digital, and even Kodak had become a leader in digital printing. However, the real root cause was that Kodak missed the new rules of modern ecosystem disruption. Could you explain what went wrong and why they are trapped in the long game? So please.
Well, Yamaguchi-san, thank you so much for the discussion. It's a pleasure to see you again. And it's a pleasure to be able to share these ideas.
Yeah.
I guess if we start with that Kodak story, which certainly, in the United States is the most overtold technology failure story. And I'm pretty sure that people are familiar with it in Japan as well. It's a very intriguing misunderstanding of not just facts, but also core strategy.
Yeah.
So the usual story is that Kodak was this very successful photography company, and they invent the idea of digital photography in the 1970s. And then because they are such a big and lumbering organization, and because they make so much money in chemical printing, and they're so focused on traditional competitors like Fuji, the story says that that's why they ignored digital transformation, and in 2011 they go bankrupt, because that's what happens when you are a big, slow, inert organization. And we tell that story to scare managers and executives, to make sure that they're not comfortable, that they're not asleep, and to motivate them to be more aggressive when they innovate. Now, it turns out that story is 100% wrong. Well, it's correct in that Kodak does go bankrupt.
Yeah.
But it is 100% wrong in that in the 1990s, Kodak was still trying to figure out what to do with digital. But by 2000, they made a corporate-wide commitment to become a leader in digital photography, because what they realized when they looked at rivals like HP and Lexmark is that as much money as there was to make in photography and chemical photography with developers and paper, wow, these digital printing companies were making so much money with ink and paper. And Kodak had a realization that, the technology transition is really not impossible for them. They had a huge technological advantage in sensors that they use inside their photo labs. It turns out, chemicals are chemicals, whether it's a developer or whether it's printer ink. And over the course of the next 10 years, they truly transformed themselves to become the number one seller of digital cameras in America. They become the number 4 seller of inkjet printers in the world. I mean, they do this incredible thing, but they still die. And the heart of understanding this notion of winning the right game, the reason I use Kodak as the kickoff example is because the title, Winning the Right Game, is supposed to alert you that it's not just about winning, but it creates a possibility of winning the wrong game. And this is the new environment that we face, particularly as the world is becoming more and more digital. And so, by the way, the short version of, what the reason Kodak went bankrupt was not because they couldn't make a big transition from being a chemical printing company to being a digital printing company. It's that digital viewing, the screen, made anything in terms of printing, chemical or digital printing, basically irrelevant. And this is a very different kind of disruption that requires a very different approach in order to see. And, in some ways, the first step to understanding this is stepping back and realizing, wow, a lot of really smart people have looked at this story for 10 years and have fundamentally misunderstood it, right? The stories we told were wrong. And what that should alert us to is not that those people aren't insightful or smart. They are very insightful and very smart. But clearly there's something in the toolkit that we're using to analyze things that no longer fits the new reality. And that's this idea of winning the right game, is that sometimes our old tools break down And it is in the context of exactly what happened with Kodak, which I'll show you in the slide that you asked for. It's in the context where industry boundaries break down. So may I share a slide?
Yeah, please.
To tell the story? Okay. So let me see here. Okay. So this, by the way, this is the book, Being the Right Game, and my prior book, The Wide Lens, which I am just delighted to say are both now available in Japanese for whomever that makes life easier for. But I do encourage you to have a close read, because in this environment of what we call ecosystems, life really is different. So let me move to just a 5-minute discussion on Kodak.
Yeah.
Traditionally, when we look at the Kodak story, when we look at any kind of transformation story, we take a look at the different technologies. So traditional photography, we had a camera, we had film, we had chemicals, and we had a photo lab where things were developed. And then we look at what's required to play the new game. Wow, cameras, need a whole new technology. It's no longer about glass lenses. It's about CCD sensors, right? It's no longer about film. It's about magnetic memory cards. It's about ink cartridges instead of developers. And we're using digital printers instead of photo labs. And historically, we would look at these transitions and we would look at a company and ask, well, if you're doing the old thing, how hard is it for you to make the transition to the new? And the classic Kodak story says they're not going to be able to do it. This is what we criticized. But as I just said, in fact, they did a magnificent job of managing all of this. But something else happened. And to understand this other thing, what I suggest in this book is a perspective that, as you said, starts from the customer insight, the customer proposition, but asks us to think about how is that proposition constructed. This is what I call a value architecture, which maybe we can discuss a little bit more. But the idea is, well, what if we thought about what Kodak was trying to do, which was to deliver this value proposition of the Kodak moment, which is I'm going to give the user the ability to capture and share their memories through images. But instead of thinking about it in terms of technologies that come together to deliver that value proposition, we think about, well, how is that proposition constructed? And so this idea of a value architecture asks us to think in terms of a different set of categories. And so here, as an example, is, well, if your value proposition is to relive memories and share memories through images, well, how does that happen? Well, I guess you need to capture the image in some way. You need to produce the image. You need to be able to look at that image, and you need to be able to share it. And if we think according to these categories, the way we'll think about digital disruption, the way we'll think about the evolution here becomes quite different. So let me tell you the Kodak story through this lens, and I think this will set up the rest of the conversation. So keep in mind, Kodak's big idea was that they were going to make money, instead of with film and paper, that they were going to make money with printer ink and photo paper for printers. This is where Hewlett-Packard was making their money. This is where Lexmark was making their money. So we need these other elements, but we have a clear profit focus. And when we look at the world in this way, we can think about, okay, kind of traditional photography. Well, how is capture done? Well, we have lens-based cameras and we use film. The way you produce the image is in a photo lab with chemical developers. You view the image on paper and you share it by giving friends and family duplicate prints. Okay, that was the old world. And then we get this transition to digital photography. And the first part of this transition was the rise of cameras that are totally different, right? The way we did capture was using cameras that now have sensors, right? They don't have film, they have memory cards. So that's a big transition. Well, what happens in produce? Well, produce gets changed quite dramatically as well, because now we're using digital printers, you have ink cartridges. View doesn't change, right? You're still printing paper and you're still viewing on paper. And the way you share is, well, now you can move that digital file around through email, and then somebody, your mother, your grandmother, at her house, she will print the photo using her printer, spending money on paper and ink, and that's how share will happen. Okay, so that's one set of transitions. The next set of transitions was, again, a change in capture. Suddenly, cameras no longer needed to be standalone devices. We could take that technology, miniaturize it, lower cost, higher quality, and now you can put a image captured technology inside of something else. In this case, a phone. This is when Nokia becomes the world's biggest seller of cameras. Now, what's interesting is, so there's this big change in the capture column. Nothing really changes in produce, right? We're still, you have cameras in everybody's pockets. So that's good. We're all taking more pictures. More of those pictures are good and worth printing. And so we'll make more money with selling more paper and more ink. View doesn't change. Share doesn't change. All good. And remember, Kodak's focus was making money and produce. The big aha comes in this next generation. And notice that up until now, every transition, even though I grouped them according to these different categories, it's all been technological. Our old tools explained everything. In this next generation, though, something interesting happens, which is an innovation that starts in capture, which is the smartphone with a bigger screen, higher quality screen, more memory. That doesn't actually change the way you produce an image, right? Because the camera is not a printer. But with this much better screen and much more memory, Apple called their new display a retinal quality display. Something changed in view, which is suddenly the image that you saw on the phone screen was of as high quality as what you could get from the printer. And what we see here with this horizontal arrow is a shift that is moving across categories, not changing technology inside a box, but impacting a box separate from itself. And of course, the phone will never be a printer, but if the phone impacts how we view and we no longer need paper in order to view, well, that certainly will have an impact on the printer market, on the ink market, and certainly have an impact on how we share photos. And so this is the dynamic, this horizontal dynamic that leads to a very different kind of disruption, right? And so the Kodak story is so poignant because they wanted to be the world's best printer maker. And in some ways, they were close to winning that game, but it turned out that it was the wrong game, right? Being the best printer in a world where people stop printing, missing these horizontal transitions, this is what's key to setting strategy in a world of ecosystems, in a world where change reverberates across these boxes, doesn't stay within them. And that's the heart of this new approach to strategy that I'm excited to share in these books.
Thank you. I can understand how and why Kodak was interrupted in the long game. So I would like to ask next question. In the business world, please.
By the way, even though we talk about Kodak, this same dynamic collapsed Hewlett-Packard, it collapsed Lexmark. Everybody who was betting on produce and printing was hit in the same way. So this is not a Kodak only problem. And again, kind of the thing to do as we think about this new explanation is, well, what is it that we missed, and what is it that my own organization in my own context might be falling for in the exact same way?
Thank you. So I would like to ask next questions. In the business world, the definition of ecosystem is rather vague. For example, it is often defined a system where multiple companies collaborate to produce products and services. To win the right game, I think we need to start from standpoint of customer experience instead of products and services to gain customer insight. You define an ecosystem as a structure through which partners interact to deliver a value proposition to the end consumer. I think this approach is helpful in formulating ecosystem strategy and analyzing our competitive landscape within the ecosystem. Could you kindly dive deeper on this definition of ecosystems?
Yeah, so that's it's a great question, and it's one that actually I wrestled with for a long time, especially as this word ecosystem has become so pervasive. You know, we hear it all the time, and usually the way it's used is to signal multiple companies are doing multiple things and delivering something more exciting than just a regular product or a regular service. And that's true, but in order to make that a useful construct, my sense is that we have to be able to be clear about structure. And as you noted in the definition you cited, so the way I define an ecosystem is that an ecosystem is the structure through which partners interact to deliver a value proposition to an end consumer. And the anchor of that definition is the value proposition, right? And by the way, the reason that matters is because often we hear people talking about ecosystems and anchoring their notion of an ecosystem in a firm, right? A Sony ecosystem, an Apple ecosystem. And that approach will tend to make it harder to see. It will create blindness to the other critical parts of this definition, which are the structure through which these different partners interact. When you define your ecosystem with a firm in the middle, it makes it harder to see the partners that are critical for the value proposition, but with which you may not have a direct interaction. And because of that, it makes it harder to understand the structure, but not just the structure, but how that structure might need to change as you are offering a richer value proposition. And so for me to have a productive conversation of strategy and ecosystems, we have to get to the level of structure. And it's from there that we can think about how structure is changing. And then we can think about strategy.
Thank you. I understand your definition of ecosystem. And you also state the threat in ecosystem disruption comes from helpful partners becoming too good and destroying the basic of leaders' value creation. And finally, disintegrating the pie itself. This means that a technology shift could turn our partner who provide complementary goods into our competitor. This is very interesting. So, could you elaborate on this mechanism?
Yeah, happily. So, I think if you think about that Kodak picture that we just looked at, all the transitions that went down the vertical line were about technology substitution. They were about you're doing your job one way and somebody else coming in and doing that job in a different way. That's how we were used to thinking, right? So traditionally competition takes one of two different shapes. One is it's other companies that look like your company and are trying to do your job in a very similar way to you. We call them rivals. And two is companies that come in and they use a different technology to do your kind of job, and we call them substitutes. If they come in with a technology that is initially not quite as good, then we call them disruptors, right? If you think about the work of Clayton Christensen and the Innovator's Dilemma, it was all about how do you see these substitutes before they become very threatening. But what is true of both rivals and substitutes is that as soon as you see them, you know that they are bad news. Now, the story that we just looked at with Kodak is interesting because the disruption happened not from somebody making a better printer, not from somebody making a cheaper ink. It came from this thing on the side. It came from something that in the beginning, as it got better and better, was good news, right? So as cameras got better, that was good news for people making printers, right? And as if you think about that horizontal, the vertical line, when we moved from standalone digital cameras to phone-based cameras, well, that was very bad news. That was clear substitution. If you're Sony or Nikon, now facing Nokia and Motorola, who are making phones that now have cameras. But as soon as you saw that, you knew that was bad news. So we have classic substitution taking place. But moving to those phone-based cameras was actually very good for the printer companies because now everybody had a camera in their pocket and they could take more pictures and more of those pictures would be printed. And then they put a screen on that camera. And again, that was a technology leap for the makers of the cameras. But what it meant was that people could take better pictures, they could frame, they could see what they were doing. More better pictures means more pictures to be printed. But then we took it one step too far. The screen got, instead of in the classic disruption story, we worry about substitutes that are becoming good enough. Here, the screen became too good. This thing that was good up until now, it became too good, and now it was as good as the paper. And it's not that the screen became a printer. It's that a screen that was that good meant that you didn't need to print on paper. And suddenly, it wasn't that one generation of printing technology was losing share. It's that the whole point of printing loses relevance. And this is a very, very different kind of disruption. Right? It's a disruption that happens from the side, from someone who's already in the system, and by the way, is in the system and in the system at scale. So when they cross this line of becoming too good, they become a very different kind of disruptor than we're used to thinking about. And this was a really, again, I encourage people to go into the thought process expressed in this book, but this is a kind of competitive environment that historically we've never thought about. And this is partly why we could look at this Kodak story for 10 years and misunderstand it, because we didn't have a concept or a language for exploring this kind of interaction. And you know, I'm sure, you know, at this point people are like, a natural question is, well, you know, that seems pretty clear after the fact. Can you actually use this kind of tool, this kind of framework to look at a real-time situation and project forward? And the answer is yes. Yes, these are logic tools of logic. We can apply them not just backwards but also forward, which is part of what makes this so exciting.
Thank you. So I understand that ecosystem disruption is quite different from disruption in classical competition in product and services. And so I would like to ask next questions. What should we do when we find that our ecosystem partners may become our competitors in the future? Should we stay in the market by acquiring such businesses? Or should we exit the market and go to a new market by leveraging strengths that we already have? As you know, in case of Fujifilm, a Japanese film manufacturer, it has successfully diversified its portfolio into pharmaceuticals and cosmetics by harnessing its chemical technology it has developed through film production. Currently, its film business only accounts for less than 5% in its total revenues. So, which strategy should we take when we face such a threat? Could you share your opinion about this?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And part of what makes it a great question is that I guess first of all, it's important to understand the question presumes that you know what you're looking at, right? And so the first part of the answer is you need to understand in what way your ecosystem is being disrupted.
Yeah.
Now, the Fuji story is a very powerful one because Fuji looked at this situation and made the decision that, you know what, we're not going to fight this. We're not going to fight this game. Right? They looked internally, they identified what their true core capabilities were, and they found very exciting markets in which to redeploy them. As you say, cosmetics and particularly pharmaceutical production have turned out to be incredibly enriching, both from a societal perspective where they can create so much value, but also from an economic perspective. It has been a great place to deploy those resources. Now, what's interesting is that the answer, once you see the disruption, the answer of response will depend very much on who you are as a company. So Kodak didn't have the same options as Fuji, because 10 years earlier, Kodak had sold off its chemical manufacturing business, so that the Kodak that was facing digital photography disruption was the camera company. They had sold that because of brilliant financial engineering. They had split what had been Kodak to being Eastman Chemicals as the chemical company, which would be doing what Fuji is currently doing, and then Kodak, the photo company. But even within the photo company, it turns out that they were doing a number of different things. Now, in the story of Kodak, it's not as though they were in a position to stop the disruption, right? No one was in a position to stop screens from getting better. So the idea of fighting back doesn't work. In other contexts, it does. And I actually explore this. Again, I encourage people to read the book. In chapter 2, I talk about how you defend against disruption and kind of the stories of Spotify versus Apple and TomTom versus Google Maps. But in the Kodak case, they couldn't fight against what was coming. But they could have looked at the change and made a different set of decisions, right? And so here it's interesting. Kodak turns out, if you think about that architecture of capture, produce, view, and share, Kodak made its big bet that it was going to make money and produce with inks and paper. But it turned out that they had a very strong technology advantage in the the capture bucket. That Kodak had a very strong position in optical imaging that came from technology that they had developed for their chemical photo labs. And those that sensor knowledge and those patents were very, very valuable in the world of digital imaging. Kodak was getting license fees for its sensor IP of hundreds of millions of dollars per licensing party. And so one thing they could have done was, in looking at this, had they realized that this bucket of produce might go away, right? By the way, it's not realistic. It wouldn't be fair to say, I could have shown up at Kodak in 2000 and told them, oh my God, printing is going to disappear, don't go there. That's not reasonable. By 2007, however, remember the iPhone is now out, these big glass screens are now out. You couldn't say in 2007 that printing was going to disappear, but you should have been able to look at this framework and say, wow, something in capture is going to affect view. Printing is in more danger than we thought, right? So that doesn't mean it's going to die, but maybe it means that we don't want to put everything in that one bucket. Maybe we want to split our bets. And so Kodak was certainly in a position to split its bets and put half of the resource on produce and put the other half in strengthening their position and capture and becoming a leading sensor firm, which they did. By the way, I mean, that's a big business for Sony today, is their sensor business, and that is definitely something that Kodak could have been a true leader in. There's an interesting side story about the company Lexmark, which was also a printing company. And Lexmark saw that people were printing less and less. And what they did starting in 2008, so long before the complete disruption, but what they did was they decided that they were going to, that printing itself was going to go away, but that there was an adjacency of document and information management, that by having a footprint in printers and scanners, they would be able to exploit. And what they end up doing is, over the course of 4 years, they take while their share price is still high, they engage in a slew of acquisitions. They start buying up software companies, and they transform themselves into a document management company that gets acquired, I think it's like 2014, 2015, and it's acquired for 2.5 times as much money as the company was worth in 2008. So, looking at the inevitable decline of printing, they were able to find a better spot and, create a lot of value for themselves and their shareholders. And so that's to say, as soon as you see it, you can then ask your very wise question. The answer to the question will depend on who you are and what you have. But I mean, this is what I tell my students all the time. It's not the answer, right? If you know how to ask the right question, you can figure out the answer. If you don't know the right question, there's no answer that will help you.
Thank you. I understand that the strategies we should take depend on the technology which we accumulated and considering market situation. So there is not one answer when we face the threat of ecosystem disruption.
Ecosystem disruption. Yep.
Thank you. And next, the idea about ecosystem disruption is very insightful, and I can understand that such dynamics could work in ecosystems. Our partners could replace our leader position through a technology shift. What steps should we take to build and grow ecosystems? Please answer.
So it's. I think the question is a really good one, because as soon as we realize that this is the dynamic, the question is how do we respond? And even if we come up with the idea of, let's do some transformation, like Lexmark, let's be a document management company. It's not something that you flip a switch and happens overnight. And often, if you're thinking about building a new position, particularly an ecosystem position, what it requires is change not just on your own, but you need to line up a new set of partners in a new way. You need to build new ecosystem. And so here, there are 3 principles of ecosystem construction that I have introduced. And the guiding philosophy, by the way, is that ecosystem construction, which is the key to ecosystem disruption, the key to doing these new things, it happens not all alone, and also not all at once. So a strategy for ecosystem construction, which is a strategy of how to align partners, needs to be thinking about where you're going to start and how are you going to take a staged pathway towards that final strategic destination. And so the 3 concepts that I would recommend people think about are, first, what I call a minimum viable ecosystem. So when we imagine the future, we see this very rich value proposition that can be created, that we need partners to participate in new ways. But what we know is right now, it's us alone in the room. So the idea of a minimum viable ecosystem is to ask the question of what is the smallest set of interactions that I can bring together, not to excite my customer, because I know they won't be excited until I'm close to the full idea. Rather, what is the smallest set of interactions that I am in a position to bring together that will allow me to then add additional partners to get closer and closer to that value proposition that I'm really trying to build. So, and part of the way that you can construct this MVE, this minimum viable ecosystem, which is different from a minimum viable product, right? Minimum viable product is a set of ideas about how you experiment in the marketplace to figure out what your customers want. This is different. We're talking about how do you put something together to attract not customers, but partners. And so a key lever for building a minimum viable, your minimum viable ecosystem is the question of what other relationships do you already have that you can bring into that MVE. This falls under the heading of ecosystem carryover, right? This is particularly for incumbents, you already have relationships from the other markets that you serve. And can you borrow some of those to build the evidence required for attracting the new set of partners? And then staged expansion is the question and the logic of you start with the starting point, the MVE, you need 5 more partners. What's the logic that you will use to figure out which partner should be in the second position and which partner should you bring on third, right? And the logic, it's not that you didn't realize you wanted that third partner, it's that you needed the first and the second partner to have a better shot of bringing on the third partner. And so these are the 3 principles of ecosystem construction that if you incorporate them into a strategy, what they do is they make the notion of partner alignment central. And I think, what I've observed and, been able to even help companies with is you realize how much more efficient your ecosystem journey can be when you make this starting point for strategy rather than just the discovery of, gee, I thought they were going to come along and I'm disappointed that they're not.
Thank you. Value architecture is the key concept of ecosystem creations and ecosystem disruptions. Could you tell me how we use value architecture?
Yeah, so let me get this. Let me share an additional slide with you.
Yeah.
That I think will, let's see, share this here, should work. Right, so we've seen this idea of a value architecture at the top of this Kodak story. Now let me explain the concept a little bit, because this was a critical discovery for me in trying to understand how to understand the Kodak story. So if you think about the way we approach strategy, usually our starting point, very correctly, is we start with some notion of customer insight. We need to have some idea of what it is that a customer wants so we can start our value creation journey. Okay. Once we have that idea, usually what we then do is we move to trying to figure out how we want to address it. And this is what we call a value proposition. Yeah. Right? And it takes a lot of thinking, a lot of effort, a lot of experimentation to come up with the right value proposition. This is where firms will do, if you think about design thinking or A/B testing or that, the minimum viable product story or market research, this is all about getting into the head of the consumer in order to be more confident that the effort you're about to undertake will actually, if you can deliver it, that it will actually create value. Now, once we have confidence in the value proposition, what we then do is we think about, well, how do we build it? And here we move to the level of the activities required to build the value proposition. And my first book, The Wide Lens, which I encourage everybody to read as well, was really about, as you're thinking about these activities, how do you make sure that you're not just looking at your own activities, but that you're already thinking about what it is that partners need to do? And the notion of the wide lens, the widening of the lens, was to say that besides executing on your own effort, how do you think about partners who need to innovate for your innovation to matter? This is what I called co-innovation. And how do you think about partners who need to buy in order for you to deliver not your product, but your value proposition? So these are kind of the partners that are critical to your value proposition, but are not on your critical path. And this is what I talk about in terms of your adoption chain. So this was, that was already for me kind of a breakthrough. But what we realize is that this is still at the level of activities. And there's nothing here. There was nothing in Wide Lens that could explain ecosystem disruption. Right? There's nothing in Wide Lens that let me understand what happened to Kodak. To understand that, I needed to identify, to invent a level of analysis that sits between the value proposition and the activities. That was this idea of a value architecture. And here, it's the value architecture is as you're thinking about your value proposition, how do you see it coming together conceptually? Right? So the value architecture that we just shared with Kodak was capture, produce, view, and share. Right? You can imagine a different firm trying to go after the same value proposition and having a different set of concepts in its mind. Right? Like they could say compose, like what it is that you're trying to capture in the image. And they can add beyond share, they might say archive, right? Because you want to store this for the future. How do you find ways of retrieving these memories? But whatever that architecture is will then shape how you see any change. And really the idea in winning the right game, the aha is that in a world of industries, all competitors have basically the same value architecture. Like everything's been solidified. And the question becomes, who's doing what element better or worse? Another way of saying that is that in most industries, really what we're thinking about is technology as an architecture. And the question becomes benchmarking rivals to see who's doing higher quality, lower cost, et cetera. But that's because the value proposition is understood, the activity set has matured. When we launch new value propositions, part of what happens is that we as organizations need to not necessarily be explicit, it could just be implicit in the mind of the founder, need to have some philosophy of how it is we're creating this value. And if that philosophy remains unarticulated, then we can just go to technologies and benchmark there. But if we can surface the value architecture, if we can say, actually, the way we here at Kodak really think, we think about capture, we think about produce, we think about view, we can then take any change in the environment and go through that exercise that we did on that slide with all the boxes, which is, how does a change impact every one of these elements? And we can identify changes that impact not just the vertical lines, but the horizontal lines, right? So the value architecture was the only way that I was able to come up with, to invent, that lets me understand these cross-box dynamics. And that is the key to understanding true ecosystem disruption, which is separate from technology disruption. And my hope, my experience now with numerous firms is that it's a very revealing exercise. And so I hope that this will be useful to everyone listening to this discussion that I'm enjoying so much.
Well, thank you. I understand value architecture is very helpful to clarify what we should do or what capabilities we should have in order to deliver value proposition to the customers. So, thank you. And next, I would like to ask questions. You described a wrong mindset could end in failure in building and operating ecosystems. So, will you share what mindset the ecosystem leaders should have and how it differs from the traditional leaders' mindset? Will you share?
Yes, this is a great tour through the ideas of the book. So the one of the discoveries that you come about when you realize that the ecosystem story is really about aligning partners. What it means is that alignment is a top priority. And when you contrast that with the way in which we work in mature industries, alignment is not critical, because for us to talk about a mature industry, essentially what it means is everything is already aligned. And so there's this contrast between an execution mindset, which is, we look at a leader who really understands the customer, who understands their organization, who puts their organization before themselves. These are spectacular leaders at execution. When we need to align partners, what we find out is that a leader that puts their own company first makes a little less sense for partners who need to rely on this company to put together an ecosystem. And so there's this natural tension between an execution mindset, which is how do you maximize your value capture? How do you maximize your efficiency? How do you be the best company you can be? Versus an alignment mindset, which is how do you bring together this new team of companies to deliver a value proposition that the world has never seen before? And how do you make your partners feel confident and secure that their efforts will not just be successful in delivery, but that their own value capture will be assured? And so the aha here is it's not that one kind of leader is better than the other. It's that these are two different kinds of leadership mindsets that need to match where you are in the ecosystem cycle, right? When all the relationships are clear and mature, when you can think about your firm and your industry, then execution mindset wins. But when the game is to pull together new companies in new ways, then you have to be able to put the coalition ahead of the company, and that is a very different mindset, a very different set of capabilities and trainings, and so that requires, if not a different leader, it certainly requires that leader to change their philosophy in order to be successful.
Thank you. You explained that as organizations and industries mature, they stop thinking actively about the structure of the value element ecosystem, and you argue that a coherent way is needed to shift the focus of corporate goals away from the narrow, such as shareholder value enhancement, and toward broader value creation. I am totally with you on this point. That is why we must create a learning organization where people and organization can continuously learn to create new values based on the company's purpose and mission. So, last, I would like to ask questions. I believe that building ecosystems can provide value for citizens' experience, and such ecosystems should encompass public and private sectors to help address social issues. Could you share your thought with us?
Yeah, I think this is a critical question that you're asking. And it is becoming, I mean, look, we're still living with the repercussions of the COVID virus. And it's interesting, the COVID experience is a very powerful example of an ecosystem disruption, right? So COVID is a virus. It's supposed to be a healthcare problem, right? It's supposed to stay in the healthcare box. But what happened with COVID is that it reverberated into every other feature of society. It affected economics, it affected trade, it affected international relations, it affected everything. And it's an example of the kind of societal challenge that we're facing, like, global warming, right? So it used to be that, environmentalists worried about too much smoke coming from a factory. That was in a box. You fix that with putting scrubbers on the chimney. Global warming today is rising sea levels. It's rampant fires. It falls outside of the purview of any one silo or any one department. And so the problems that we're facing as aging, right? The problem that we're facing as a society no longer match the silos that we have built our society around. And so the only way that we're going to be able to address them is to find new ways of aligning these critical functions. And these functions cross the for-profit sector and the non-profit sector and the government sector in very interesting and very powerful ways. And in some ways, when we see society doing well, it's when someone has figured out how to build a coalition, because nobody can do it themselves, a coalition that allows for a new kind of interaction that goes across those silos. And my hope is that and by the way, they're using exactly the same kind of strategy as the for-profit ecosystem strategy, because what matters in ecosystems, it's not the profit motive, it's the goal of a new alignment structure. And so my hope is that focusing and thinking about strategy in this way will be of help, not just to the traditional corporate sector, but really to regulators and policymakers and people in the nonprofit sector who are critical partners in solving these societal problems. So I'm with you. This is critically important for us as citizens of this planet today.
Thank you. Thank you for having shared very thoughtful and insightful opinions and advice. I'm very delighted to hear that the idea of customer value delivery ecosystems can help to solve social issues. Really appreciate it. We believe that the customer value reinvention strategy can be applied to society as a whole. And we have been working on this agenda. So finally, let me share our solution called the Resilio. Here in Japan, there are many natural disasters. Therefore, we have been promoting this service, which creates an ecosystem and provides value for relevant stakeholders such as citizens in the affected areas, local governments, construction, and instruction and insurance companies. The Resilio is designed to enable smoother evacuation, restoration activities, and more. I believe this is an ecosystem which each stakeholder can benefit. We started small but achieved this through collaborative leadership. So, Dr. Adona-san, once again, I thank you for your valuable thoughts and opinions. Lastly, do you have any message for Japanese audience before we close this session? Please.
Well, I have to say how much I enjoyed our conversation. I think this last example that you brought up of D'Urzilio is a beautiful example of what we're talking about. And I think, both for Japanese society focused on Japan, but Japan's role in the broader world is all linked to this idea of more and more effective collaboration and structure. And so it's a special honor to be able to share these ideas with you, with the Japanese audience. And so I say a very deep and humble thank you. I say, domo arigato.
Thank you.
For the conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Adona-san, for having spent time with us today. I really enjoyed this conversation. I look forward to meeting with you in person. Thank you.
Me as well.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.